At exactly 2:17 a.m., when the world was quiet enough for thoughts to become loud, Adam lay motionless in his bed, phone resting on his chest like evidence of a crime he kept committing against himself, heart racing not from excitement but from a strange inner conflict he could never fully explain. Because how do you explain wanting something that makes you feel powerful for a moment and hollow immediately after? How do you explain craving something that promises relief but delivers regret? And more importantly, how do you admit that the scariest part isn't the desire itself, but how familiar it feels? Because familiarity creates comfort, even when it's destructive. And this is where the real prison begins, not in the body, but in the mind, because lust doesn't arrive as an enemy. It arrives as a friend, a solution, a shortcut out of stress, boredom, loneliness, rejection, pressure, and the quiet fear of not becoming who you thought you'd be by now. And the brain, always efficient and never moral, learns quickly. This works. This makes the pain stop, even if only for a moment. So it repeats the loop without asking for permission. And soon the urge stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like a command, which is why people swear they'll stop tomorrow while knowing deep down that tomorrow looks exactly like today. And here's the uncomfortable truth most motivational speakers avoid. Lust is rarely about sex. It's about escape. It's about the mind running from silence, because silence forces self-confrontation. And when you don't like who you're becoming or feel stuck in who you are, desire becomes anesthesia, numbing awareness just long enough to avoid asking hard questions. And the danger isn't that the urge is strong. It's that the identity quietly shifts from I'm someone experiencing temptation to I'm someone who can't control himself. And once that belief settles in, the brain stops resisting because it hates fighting what it believes is permanent. And this is why highly intelligent, ambitious, self-aware people often fall deeper into this trap, because they rationalize it, intellectualize it, and convince themselves that self-control is overrated, that everyone does it, or that discipline can wait until life feels more stable. But neuroscience exposes a darker mechanism at play. Dopamine is not the chemical of pleasure, it's the chemical of anticipation, meaning the mind is hijacked not by the act, but by the story it tells itself beforehand, the promise of relief, the fantasy of control, the illusion of reward. And once the brain learns the pattern of trigger, urge, action, regret, it stops caring about the regret, because regret happens after the dopamine has already been spent. So the cycle continues deeper and faster, and the scariest part is how invisible this prison is. Because from the outside, everything looks normal, productive, functional, but internally there's erosion. Confidence leaks away slowly, focus weakens, discipline fractures, and self-trust dissolves. And without self-trust, ambition becomes fantasy instead of fuel. And this is where most people get it wrong. They try to fight lust with shame, morality, or brute willpower, not realizing that shame strengthens the cycle, willpower collapses under stress, and suppression turns desire into obsession. But tonight, this isn't about guilt, purity, or self-hatred. This is about understanding the psychological mechanics of desire so precisely that it loses its power over you. Because the moment you can see the strings, the puppet stops dancing, and what you're about to learn isn't a list of rules or motivational hype. It's a system, 5 psychologically engineered steps that rewire how desire operates at the identity level, not by resisting it, but by dismantling its foundation. And if you stay with me until the end, you won't just feel motivated, you'll understand why you were never weak, why this struggle was never random, and why mastery over desire is less about becoming someone new and more about reclaiming the authority you slowly gave away without realizing it. The first real shift happens the moment you stop asking, how do I stop this? And start asking a far more dangerous question. Why does this urge feel like me? Because the brain doesn't just experience impulses, it labels them. And once an impulse is labeled as identity, resistance collapses automatically. This is why people say things like, I've always been like this, or this is just my nature, not realizing they've handed over authority to a temporary neurological event. And psychology calls this fusion, when thoughts and urges merge with self-image. And fused thoughts don't feel optional, they feel factual. Which is why the first step to mastering desire is not control, but separation, learning to observe the urge as a sensation passing through you, rather than a command issued by who you are. And this sounds simple until you try it, because observation requires stillness, and stillness is exactly what the addicted mind avoids. But here's the hidden mechanism. The moment you mentally say, I'm noticing an urge, instead of I want this, you activate the prefrontal cortex, the rational part of the brain responsible for long-term thinking, and when that area comes online, the limbic system, the impulsive desire engine, loses dominance, meaning awareness itself becomes an act of power. And this is why monks, soldiers, and high-performance individuals train awareness before discipline. Because discipline without awareness is fragile, but awareness rewires instinct, and once this separation is practiced, the second step becomes possible, breaking the dopamine prediction loop. Because desire is never as strong as the moment before action, it's strongest in anticipation, in the fantasy, in the buildup, and the brain is addicted not to pleasure but to prediction, to the expectation that relief is coming. And this is where most people unknowingly sabotage themselves by sitting still and negotiating with the urge, replaying mental images, arguing internally, delaying without movement, which only feeds the anticipation and strengthens the loop. But interruption is the weapon here, not suppression. Because when you physically change state, stand up, move rooms, wash your face, step into cold air, you send a powerful signal to the nervous system that the pattern has been broken, and the brain, confused and deprived of completion, begins to weaken the association. And this is critical to understand. Every time you interrupt the loop without completing it, you are not failing to indulge. You are actively rewiring neural pathways, teaching the brain that the trigger no longer guarantees a reward. And over time, triggers lose intensity, not because you became more disciplined, but because the brain stops wasting energy on a prediction that no longer pays off. And here's the part that most people don't want to hear. Your urges are not random, they are scheduled. They appear when energy is low, when purpose is unclear, when nights are unstructured, when the mind is idle and the future feels distant. And if you keep treating lust as a moral problem instead of a behavioral pattern, you'll keep losing the same fight with new excuses. Because the brain doesn't respond to guilt, it responds to consequence and consistency. And once you stop dramatizing the urge and start treating it like background noise, noticed, labeled, interrupted, it loses its emotional charge. And when the emotional charge disappears, the urge feels strangely weak, almost boring, and that boredom is not a loss. It's a sign that the mind is waking up, that the spell is breaking, and this is the moment where most people either relapse or level up, because boredom forces you to confront the deeper question you've been avoiding all along. If I'm not escaping into Sire, what am I supposed to do with this energy, this restlessness, this dissatisfaction? And that question leads directly into the next step, where desire stops being an enemy and starts becoming fuel. Once the loop begins to weaken and the urge no longer feels like identity, something unsettling happens that most people aren't prepared for. You're left with raw energy, restless, uncomfortable, buzzing beneath the skin, because lust was never just a craving. It was a container for excess drive, and when that container is removed, the energy doesn't disappear, it demands a new destination, and this is where step 3 becomes non-negotiable: transmutation, the deliberate redirection of desire into output, because unchanneled energy always mutates into self-destruction. And history quietly proves this. Some of the most disciplined warriors, creators, and leaders weren't free of desire. They were masters at converting it, turning tension into training, frustration into focus, and longing into ambition. And psychologically, this works because the brain doesn't distinguish between sexual energy and creative drive. It only recognizes intensity, meaning when you engage in hard physical movement, deep work, or meaningful creation, the same circuits light up, but with a longer-lasting reward. Which is why people who lift heavy, run hard, build relentlessly, or pursue difficult goals report a strange side effect. Urges don't vanish, they dissolve into momentum, and this is where many fail, not because they lack discipline, but because they underestimate how much structure desire requires. Because when your days are soft, unchallenged, and repetitive, lust becomes the strongest stimulus. Loose available, the brain's fastest way to feel alive. But when your life contains friction, resistance, and forward motion, indulgence starts to feel like a downgrade, not a temptation. And this leads directly to step 4. The step that quietly decides everything: environmental control, because no amount of self-awareness can override a poorly designed environment. And this is where brutal honesty is required. If your phone is always within reach, if your nights have no boundaries, if your room is associated with indulgence instead of rest, then your struggle is not psychological, it's architectural. And expecting self-control in a temptation-rich environment is like expecting a starving man not to eat. When food is placed in front of him, the brain is predictive and contextual. It associates places, times, and objects with reward, which means if you don't change the surroundings, you're fighting memory itself. And this is why the most effective change doesn't come from motivation, but from friction. Making indulgence slightly harder and growth slightly easier, moving devices out of reach, changing rooms when urges appear, sleeping earlier, structuring nights, scheduling physical exhaustion, because the brain always chooses the path of least resistance. And if discipline requires more effort than indulgence, indulgence will win every time. But once the environment is redesigned, something fascinating happens. The urge still appears, but it feels out of place, weaker, disconnected, like a habit that no longer belongs in the room it's trying to survive in. And this is when people finally realize the truth they were never taught. Self-control is not about being strong, it's about being strategic, because strength is temporary, but structure is permanent. And when your environment aligns with who you're becoming instead of who you were, desire loses its leverage, not through force, but through irrelevance. And this is the turning point where the struggle shifts from exhausting resistance to quiet authority, where indulgence no longer feels forbidden, just unnecessary. And yet, there is still one final danger left, the old identity, waiting for moments of weakness to reclaim control. And that is exactly what the final step dismantles completely. At some point in every real transformation, there comes a moment that feels strangely quiet, almost anticlimactic, where the urge no longer screams but whispers, where temptation no longer feels urgent but distant, and most people misunderstand this moment as victory, when in reality it is the most dangerous phase of all, because the mind doesn't collapse in dramatic failure, it slowly negotiates its way back into old patterns. And this is why the final step is not about resisting desire, but rewriting identity, because behavior follows identity more faithfully than motivation ever could. And if deep down you still see yourself as someone fighting lust, your brain will keep recreating the battle, because conflict validates identity. But the moment you shift from fighter to architect, from someone resisting urges to someone designing a life where those urges no longer dominate, you trigger a deeper psychological realignment, where actions begin to match self-image automatically. And this is not philosophy, it is cognitive neuroscience. The brain constantly seeks consistency between identity and behavior, meaning if you repeatedly affirm through action that you are disciplined, focused, and future-oriented, your mind will eventually reject impulses that contradict that identity, not because they are forbidden, but because they feel foreign. And this is where patience becomes a weapon, because the brain does not change overnight. It changes through repetition that feels boring, subtle, almost invisible. And yet, it is in those invisible moments, when no one is watching, when there is no dramatic urge, when there is no applause, that true mastery is built. And here's the paradox. That frees you, urges do not disappear when you hate them. They fade when you stop negotiating with them, when you stop romanticizing them, when you stop building narratives around them, because every time you mentally argue with desire, you give it significance, and significance is fuel. But when you treat the urge like background noise, noticed, acknowledged, and ignored, the emotional charge dissolves, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the brain rewrites its priorities, replacing short-term relief with long-term meaning. And this is when something extraordinary happens. Desire stops being your master and becomes your messenger, a signal pointing toward unmet ambition, unused potential, and emotional needs you never learned to express. And instead of obeying the signal blindly, you decode it, asking not how do I satisfy this urge, but what is this urge trying to replace? And the answer is almost always the same: purpose, connection, challenge, direction. And once those elements enter your life consistently, indulgence begins to feel small, not sinful. And that is the real victory, because when something feels small, it loses its psychological gravity. And gravity is what keeps habits alive. And this is why the strongest people are not those who never feel desire, but those who feel it clearly and still choose differently, without drama, without self-hatred, without obsession. And the final truth is this: mastering desire is not about becoming cold or emotionless. It is about becoming intentional. Because the moment you realize that every urge is an invitation to either repeat the past or build the future, you stop asking whether you are strong enough and start acting as if your future self is already watching, already judging, already waiting. And once that image becomes real in your mind, lust no longer feels like pleasure. It feels like betrayal. not of rules, but of potential. And in that moment, quietly and without ceremony, the invisible prison collapses. Not because the doors were forced open, but because you finally understood that they were never locked in the first place.